Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. And this week we are going to be diving into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is 16-inch bass drums. That's stock 16-inch bass drums and also floor tom to bass drum conversions. So in this episode, we're going to be doing some comparisons of a few different tuning approaches, and then just some subtle things that you're going to want to know about with regards to setup and positioning, stuff of that nature. But before we do that, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario, for helping make all of this possible and supporting our tutorials on Tuesdays. So the setup I've got here today is a Gretsch Catalina floor tom. It's a 16 by 16 inch floor tom, super budget level drum. And this one actually never had the floor tom legs drilled into it. So it doesn't have any kind of mounting system or anything like that built in. And what I did was I added on bass drum spurs and like full-on extension spurs, and I'm using a little bass drum lift, the Dixon bass drum lift. Evans actually distributes that now, but an excellent system to be able to convert a floor tom into a bass drum. And so in terms of drum heads, this drum is currently outfitted with the UV EMAD on the batter side, and then the UV EQ4 on the reso side. I love these heads because I feel like they do a great job of controlling some of the awkward overtones, specifically when you're hitting a floor tom with a bass drum beater. It's kind of a different ball game. At the same time, I think that these heads offer some versatility, and we'll showcase that today with regards to the range of tuning that you can get out of them, going from more of a rock kind of sound with a 16-inch bass drum, then onto more of a drum and bass sound, and then finally onto kind of like a trio jazz kind of sound. So, and that's all with the same heads on there. And I should mention that the reso head, we're currently using a felt strip across the bottom. And if you aren't familiar with that process, we covered that in an episode a few weeks back, talking about the process of applying a felt strip to an 18-inch jazz bass drum. So right now, I've got the batter head on this drum tuned relatively low. It's still about a half turn, probably above finger tight. And then the reso head is a little bit lower than that to get more of this kind of rock sound that you heard in the beginning, or at least that punchier kind of approach, less overall sustain and resonance, especially compared to what you'll hear later on with the kind of drum and bass sort of thing, and then the jazz sound. We're really aiming for maximum low end and trying to get the 16 to sound more like a 20, quite possibly even a 22. And of course, for recording today, we've got our C414 over my shoulder here, and then also the AKG D112 on the reso side of the floor tom / bass drum. And those, of course, don't have any EQ or compression on them. What you're hearing is just the raw audio. I feel like particularly for this tuning, the felt strip is incredibly important because that's going to help tame some of the resonance that you're getting out of the reso head, especially because we're leaving the reso head super low on this one. And the approach I take for tuning is getting it to the point where you can tap it with a stick and you've gotten past that awkward kind of like flappy sound. You'll know what I'm talking about if you've ever started out finger tight and gone through the process of slowly applying a little bit of tension, and that's important here. Doing like eighth of a turns, quarter tones at absolute most, but like it's just a little bit of tension. So let's hear what the drum sounds like right now on its own. So there is something particularly interesting about this setup, and you'll notice, of course, we don't have a port in the reso head of the bass drum. It would have to be a relatively small port in order to still get the low end that we're trying to achieve with such a small drum. But interestingly enough, I found that you can kind of get away with burying the beater on this drum if you absolutely want to. Like if you're really trying to punch through, you can get that to work. Now, the drum can sometimes exhibit sort of a basketball-y sound, and what I'm talking about with that sort of thing is that like awkward high frequency response that you get that we liken to the sound of a basketball bouncing on the ground. You'll hear that there's just this awkward internal resonance. But if that's layered with a full groove and then you've got instruments in front of that, whether you're playing live or even in a studio environment, you can kind of get away with it. So you can hear, you could sort of get away with that approach. Now, generally, I'll still prefer, just from a feel and overall technique standpoint, I feel like playing off the head, having the beater come back, and that's just kind of how I like to do it. With a drum this small, I'm trying to get a little bit more resonance out of it, and you'll notice that burying the beater does cut off the sustain just a little bit. May or may not come through that clearly in the recording, but you'll notice it from behind the drum without a doubt. Another important thing to mention here is that it's important to keep in mind how the beater of the bass drum pedal is contacting the drum. In this case, it's not dead center. It's a little bit higher than that, and I've got it positioned in such a way that the pedal is close enough to the drum that the beater is contacting the drum head completely vertical, that it's not having to overcorrect. And something you're probably going to have to do is, whether you're using sort of a conversion kit for your floor tom, or if you're using a drum that has bass drum spurs or something like that, you're likely going to have to extend those spurs pretty far out to get it up to the appropriate height and get that angle just right, even with the use of a little bass drum lift. And again, I love the plastic bass drum lifts, the Dixon lift, just because it's super simple, it's inexpensive, and it's incredibly effective. It also gets the drum up off the floor just a little bit from a sonic standpoint, so you are able to get more low-end boom out of a relatively small drum. Of course, stick around to the end of the video and we will do a little bit of a discussion about specific heads that you should consider and things to watch out for with regards to the heads that you're using and ordering depending on the 16-inch bass drum that you have, whether it's a converted floor tom or it's one of the stock bass drums from some of the micro kits that are becoming popular right now. Next up, we're going to experiment with bringing up the tension on both of the heads a little bit, getting a little bit more resonance out of it, and producing more of a drum and bass sort of tone for you. But before we do that, we're going to take a little break here, pay the bills, and hopefully keep the lights on. While we've seen all sorts of practice pads over the years that are essentially a variation on a theme, the Reflex conditioning pad takes a different approach. The CP1 features two different surfaces, both a flex surface and a work surface, each one providing a different amount of rebound. The Reflex pad helps to develop smaller stabilizing muscle groups in the fingers and wrists. The overall density and compression set of the material used on both the flex and work surface provide less shock to your wrists, so you're going to experience less fatigue over the course of a practice session. On top of that, it's up to 50% quieter than most pads available on the market. And now the Reflex pad is also available in a variety of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and even gray. Visit the link in the description below to learn more about the Reflex pad. So you can probably hear that there's significantly more resonance now in the bass drum. It's carrying a lot more tone, and all I did was bring up the batter side just a little bit, and same with the reso. Now all of a sudden that note's being able to bloom a little bit more, and it's important to keep in mind that the reso head is carrying just as much of the tone, if not more of the tone, especially the way you're hearing it right now, because we do have that mic on the reso side. The C414 over my shoulder is covering a little bit more of the attack right now, and then of course the overall kit sound. Though I said that this is kind of a drum and bass sound, you can throw this in for all sorts of things. I mean, house music, a lot of hip hop stuff. I think it's really easy to achieve this sound with a smaller bass drum, and you could easily get there with an 18 or possibly even a 20, but there's something about the compact and just hip factor of a 16-inch bass drum that does this that really makes it cool for me. So next up, we're going to take it up into an even higher realm, going for more of a jazz kind of tuning, and give you a little demo of that. So immediately you can hear there's significantly more resonance, and some of that is due to the fact that I pulled the muffling ring out of the EMAD. I had the thin ring in there for both of the previous examples. For this one, I took the ring all the way out, so it's just the PVC tray that sits on the drum head itself that's acting as a little bit of an overtone control system. In terms of tuning, it's not all that difficult. What we did was brought the batter head up more than we had gone from the rock to kind of drum and bass house kind of thing, and probably like a good, I'd say, quarter to half turn. And then on the reso side, only about an eighth of a turn or so, and that was just to get a little bit more of that high frequency bump. So right now we've got a much more open and resonant bass drum sound. And this is great because, I mean, you could hear in feathering and all sorts of different like subtleties, it's nice because it fills up some space a little bit more. I like this for more of, again, kind of a trio or a quartet feel where you've got a little bit more space that you can occupy. You got to be cognizant of what's happening with the upright bass. Chances are you're going to want this to be above the range that the upright bass is in, which right now it's pretty much sitting in that space that you'd be in the clear. And you wouldn't really run into many issues with regards to harmonic issues and things of that nature where you have to worry about a song being in a particular key or something like that. At the same time, if you want to do some additional muffling, you can leave that ring in, or you could decide to apply just a little bit of additional muffling through a system that we had talked about in the past, just taking a handkerchief or a towel or something like that and putting it lightly between the pedal and the batter head itself. Now, I made mention earlier to an issue that needs to be considered with regards to the drum heads that you use on either a floor tom to bass drum conversion or on just a 16-inch bass drum that came stock as such. Now, there are different versions, different heads. Companies offer all sorts of different variations out there. One of the things, and this is a little pat on the back for myself because I was responsible for this at Evans, is making sure that for each of the 16-inch bass drum heads that they offer, there is a tom hoop version as well. Now, this of course led to the use of the EMAD on a floor tom, not played as a bass drum, but just on the side as a floor tom, which I love doing. That was something I had a blast experimenting with early on, and I really think that that's worthy of a video in and of itself in the future, and we'll talk about that for sure. But when it comes to choosing heads for your 16-inch bass drum, you have to be cognizant of whether or not you're getting a tom hoop version or a bass hoop version. The hoop system accommodates different types of drum heads, so if you have a stock kit with bass drum hoops and claws and everything on it, chances are it's going to use the bass drum hoop version of that head. Now, if you're using a floor tom to bass drum conversion, you're not going to want to use the bass drum hoop version. It's a different collar design oftentimes, and it's oftentimes a different hoop in and of itself that may or may not be compatible. Make sure that you check which one you're getting before you go ahead and order it or pick it up at your local drum shop, because one may work and one may not work. Thanks again so much for watching this episode. Hopefully you found this valuable and maybe it's inspired you to experiment with your floor tom drum, or maybe even go out and buy a 16-inch bass drum. There are more and more drum builders that are making these smaller bass drums and smaller drums in general, just because the pocket kick thing it's in right now. You know, it's fun to be able to work with, and especially if you're in a space where you want to be able to get all the drums compact and move them relatively quickly, having a much smaller bass drum is a wonderful thing. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor for this series, ProMark by D'Addario. Throughout the course of this episode, I've been using the Rebound Balance 5A with acorn tip, and I find that these are just super versatile sticks, especially for the stuff I was playing today, and get away with using them on a variety of different styles. So please let us know in the comments below if you've ever played a 16-inch bass drum. Maybe you've done the conversion yourself from a floor tom to a bass drum, or you've got a pocket kick that you enjoy playing that has a stock 16-inch bass drum. Give us a like, make sure you share the video if you enjoyed it, and of course be sure to subscribe and tap that little bell icon next to the subscribe button so that you get a notification anytime we release a brand new video. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.